Good evening. Sorry, I'm starting a little bit late due to slight technical issues, but welcome back to Bibliotherapy Live. Tonight, I'm going to be talking about homelessness in literature, and welcome to people that are joining me. Anyone that has comments or questions, do please put your questions up on Instagram or on Facebook. Um, and homelessness is a subject close to my heart, partly because I've done a lot of work at the House of St Barnabas over the years as a bibliotherapist, and all the profits that are created by any events that are done there go towards the homeless. And I do monthly events at the House of St Barnabas where I interview an author all about their life in books and talk to them about how they were formed by the books that they read. And one of the people that I was lucky enough to interview at the House St Barnabas a few years ago was Mark Johnson, who wrote this very inspiring and brilliantly written memoir of his life. And he had been homeless, living literally outside the doors of the House of St Barnabas in Soho for several years in the period when he was addicted to various drugs and living on the streets and surviving on his wits. And that was a really fascinating evening when he came along and spoke to us about his book and about his life. And that was one of the reasons that made me start thinking about homelessness in literature, because it's not a topic which is often written about by a homeless person for obvious reasons. That when you're homeless, it's very difficult to sit and write, let alone sit and read, um, because you need a bit of peace and quiet, warmth, and hopefully food in your belly in order to be able to write a book. So, this is one of the paradoxes that I'm going to be discussing this evening. And I'm going to come back to Mark Johnson in a minute. But just to give you a bit of context about homelessness in the UK at the moment, there are, this is data from about 6 months ago, I think. There were 28,882 homeless households. That's a paradox in itself, isn't it? Recorded in 2021 to 2, which is up from just over 28,000 in the previous year. This accounts for 32,592 adults and 14,372 children. Now, obviously, these figures are not going to be entirely accurate because there's going to be so many homeless people that are not recorded. But it does give you a bit of an idea of the numbers. And the numbers have been rising, unfortunately, recently due to the pandemic and also due to the rising cost of living. And I think now is an interesting time to be thinking about homelessness because it's just beginning to get incredibly cold, and it's coming up to Christmas. And I think we should all be more aware of people who are unable to live in a house. And there are so many different causes of homelessness, and this is something that very much comes out in the books that I'm going to be discussing tonight, which are either fiction or non-fiction. It can be caused by a lack of affordable housing, of course, and people paying rent and not being able to meet their rent. It can often be the result of the loss of a private short hold tenancy. There are awful, evil landlords, and I think there was a Panorama program on the other night, which lots of people watched, which was very much about ruthless landlords having no sympathy with people not being able to pay their rent. And there are many reasons. Everyone, of course, has their own individual story as to how they've become homeless. And often people who are homeless have mental health issues, either previous to becoming homeless or caused by their homeless condition. So they are not necessarily going to have any recourse to people to help them because they don't have a fixed address, so they can't go and see a doctor. But one of the things that is often a great saviour of homeless people is libraries. So we should all be trying to support our public libraries as well, because so many homeless people go and sit in libraries and find solace in a warm library where they can use a computer. And that's one of the things that comes out in one of the novels that I'll be talking about tonight, which is Paper Cup by Karen Campbell, which is a really fantastic novel that got me thinking about homelessness even more. So the key books that really got me thinking about it were Mark Johnson's Wasted, which I read a few years ago when I interviewed him, Paper Cup by Karen Campbell, that's only just come out, and also Nomadland, which is a really fantastic non-fiction book, which has also been made into a film, which I'm sure many of you might have seen or be aware of. So I'm just going to start off by reading you a little bit about homelessness in literature by Ben Myers, who is a really brilliant author who you should definitely read on other subjects. So he's written two of my favourite recent novels in the last couple of years, which are The Great Golden Circle, which is all about crop circles. And that's quite an alternative book, which does touch on living in alternative ways, and in a way a kind of simple living rather than homelessness, because one of the characters lives in an absolutely tiny house. I think it's the tiniest house in the land. This is a novel, so we don't know if it really exists. And also The Offing, which is one of my favourite novels as well, which is about a boy of 16 meeting a woman in her late 40s, and she wakes him up to the idea of poetry and literature. And it's a really beautiful and bucolic novel, all set in one summer in the 1940s, I do believe. Anyway, Benjamin Myers, he wrote this really lovely essay also about homeless literature, and I'm going to read you some of that. He says, I used to see a homeless man perched on a curb out the back of a Safeway in Camberwell. Although it looked as if he hadn't had a bath or a square meal in a while, I'm ashamed to say the thing that always elicited the most sympathy from me was that he was a passionate reader. His head was always buried in a book. Any book, horror, science fiction, romance, he was always reading. So that's what I was mentioning before. If you are a homeless person, actually writing is probably well nigh impossible. And Ben Myers says, writing while homeless, however, may be tougher to sustain. Doing it at a desk or in a warm room can be hard enough. Literature is surely the last thing on your mind when you've no food or money. According to his book, The Autobiography of a Supertramp, W.H. Davies managed it. You'd think that the predicament of homelessness would vary little from epoch to epoch, food and shelter being timeless basic human needs. But The Autobiography of a Supertramp, published more than 100 years ago, reminds us that today's homeless have a whole extra set of problems, including the stigma of being one of society's displaced. And by the way, the band Supertramp did get their name from Davies's book, The Autobiography of a Supertramp, in case you were wondering. So Davies was a wandering poet who railroaded his way across the US and Canada, where he lost a leg, by the way, when he was jumping out of a train, and tramped around the UK for 6 years. This paints a comparatively upbeat view of an England in which a tramp could depend on food and drink from generous strangers, and in which many doss houses offered bed and board indefinitely. Hardly luxurious, of course, but in Davies's world, the tramp was not the scourge of society, but a decent chap down on his luck, a vagabond rather than a smackhead. I think that's one thing that's definitely changed in the sense of portraying homeless people, and perhaps people's ideas about homeless people is that many people, when they see homeless people sitting in doorways and holding out a paper cup, like Mark Johnson was when he wrote this book, they often do think that they are smackheads and alcoholics, and that might be the first thing that comes to mind rather than the person that they were before they became homeless. As it happens, though, says Ben Myers, Davies actually chose to make himself homeless, preferring to pay for the printing of his poems rather than his rent. When he discovered that he had access to a minuscule but vital allowance, his plight appears in a slightly different light. The same problem appears at the heart of George Orwell's Down and Out in Paris and London. The book is a vital piece of socialist journalism, and Orwell undoubtedly got to the heart of what it meant to be a destitute. But when the going got exceptionally tough, he had financial benefactors he could call upon, such as his Paris-based aunt, Nellie Limousin in Paris, and also his parents, who were able to fork out money when he needed it. So there have been quite a few literary homeless people over the years who have always had the recourse of the trust fund. And G. Davies, who wrote the autobiography of the Supertramp, has been accused of being the original trustafarian because he did have this tiny stipend of money coming into his bank account, which meant that he could go ranging over America and being a kind of tramp. But he knew that when he got back and came back to the UK, there'd be money waiting for him, which had actually been growing while he'd been away, while with him having to do absolutely nothing. However, he did, when he got back to England, rather than actually go and live somewhere and use his allowance to live, he remained living on the streets and decided to spend his allowance on getting his poems published. And that's another story which we'll come to. So Ben Myers poses the question, aside from the poetry pages of the big issue, is there such a thing as literature of the homeless? Alexander Master's heartbreaking Stuart, A Life Backwards, illuminated the social problems that lead to homelessness, yet was the product of a Bedales educated Cambridge graduate. In Hunger by Knut Hamsun, Hamsun created a memorable homeless character. And this is an amazing book, if you haven't read it, by the way, Hunger, which is amazing literature, but again, not obviously written by a homeless person, but it is fiction. He becomes increasingly delirious through starvation, but still spends most of his waking moments preoccupied with selling a story to buy a loaf of bread. But then he is a fictional creation. Ben Myers says, for my money, the book that comes closest to authenticating the homeless experience is The Grass Arena by John Healy, which is an unflinching and demoralising account of Healy's time as a homeless alcoholic in London during the 1960s. And this was written once Healy had got clean and become a chess master. Rather shocking. And Myers does also point out that one of the things that unites homeless people across the centuries is libraries. It's in the library that Supertramp's narrator seeks solace from the cold to write himself out of his situation. And it's in the library that Charles Bukowski's occasionally homeless narrator of Factotum finds a secular sanctuary. The past decade has seen some charities establish mobile libraries to cater for the literary appetites of the homeless. Yet, it is the traditional library that you suspect still fulfills a more important role in providing sanctuary, warmth, peace, and access to the world of words. So libraries are incredibly important, not just for children, not just to adults who love reading, who are lucky enough to live in a house, but also libraries are very important to the homeless. And generally speaking, libraries are very welcoming to homeless people, and homeless people are able to go and use the computers of the libraries in order to fill in the forms that they have to fill in order to then possibly get some money to live on. So they're absolutely crucial. So all the more reason to keep fighting to keep our libraries open in the UK and beyond. So to talk a bit more about the biography of a Supertramp by W.H. Davies, this was written, I believe, in 1911, and the writer W. Davies, who came from Wales, actually walked into the offices of George Bernard Shaw and presented him with a collection of his poems. And Bernard Shaw was amazed by the quality of his writing, didn't know anything about the writer at all. This was actually his autobiography, which was the memoir of a Supertramp. So Bernard Shaw bought 8 copies, and when they were then reviewed in a London newspaper, Shaw realised that this amazing writer was a tramp. And he completely supported Davies and helped him to get back onto his feet and come back out of living on the streets. And it's actually a really brilliant read, which obviously does now seem a bit dated to us. And some people say that Jack London's book, The Road, is a far more fun read. However, it does have some really excellent passages, and it's a really fascinating observation of life at that time, particularly in America, because Davis actually travelled all the way to America. And George Bernard Shaw said, another effect of this book on me is to make me realise what a slave to convention I have been all my life. When I think of the way I worked tamely for my living during all of those years when Mr. Davis, a free knight of the highway, lived like a pet bird on titbits, I feel that I have been duped out of my natural liberty. So George Bernard Shaw was a big fan, and Davis was lucky enough that in 1911 he was awarded a civil list pension of £50, which later increased to £100 and then £150, and this meant that he could live comfortably for the rest of his life and concentrate on his literary work. If only one could live off £150 a year now. And he also is incredibly famous for his poem Leisure, which I will read to you, and you will all know it. You just might not have known that it's by G.W. Davies. What is this life if full of care we have no time to stand and stare? No time to stand beneath the boughs and stare as long as sheep or cows? No time to see when woods we pass where squirrels hide their nuts in grass? No time to see in broad daylight streams full of stars like skies at night? No time to turn at beauty's glance and watch her feet, how they can dance? No time to wait till her mouth can enrich that smile her eyes began. A poor life this is, if full of care we have no time to stand and stare. So that's G.W. Davies, who wrote the autobiography of a Supertramp, which is a book that I would highly recommend. And as I was saying earlier, people that are just joining, lovely to see you, that this is a book written by someone who did lead the life of an itinerant traveller and was effectively homeless, but vitally he did have recourse to a bit of finance when he needed it, in that he had family money, which was able to save him, just like George Orwell in Down and Out in Paris and London, more of which in a minute. So a book that's often compared to the autobiography of a Supertramp is Jack London's book, The Road, which is an autobiographical memoir, by Jack London, who's more famous for The Call of the Wild, one of my favourite ever books, and also White Fang. Um, and this is London's account of his experiences as a hobo in the 1890s during the worst economic depression the US had experienced up to that time. He describes his experiences hopping freight trains, holding down a train when the crew is trying to throw him off, begging for food and money, and making up extraordinary stories to fool the police. He actually tells a lot of great stories about his own brilliance at being a liar and how that managed to get him off lots of difficult situations. And his story begins with an apology to a woman in Salt Lake City that this woman, he convinced her to provide him with sustenance. And he basically spun her all kinds of stories that made her feel sorry for him. And that's why she gave him food, and they were all complete rubbish. And this was very much the same kind of thing, the same kind of imagination that he brought to his brilliant novels. So London does explore the relationship between the hobos and the law, because London was arrested along with other itinerants for vagrancy and sentenced to 30 days in jail. He experienced firsthand the capriciousness of the judicial system, and because he thought that he'd be able to talk to the judge and talk his way out of it with his silver tongue, because he had done this so often in the past. But he was completely morally outraged when the judges didn't even give him a chance to talk, and he had none of the advantages that he thought he ought to have by having an ability to tell a story, and he was still left in jail for 30 days. And by the way, I think he was actually put in prison near Niagara Falls. So I'm just reading a little bit that he wrote about that injustice. I'd show what an American boy could do when his rights and privileges had been trampled on the way mine had. I'd been denied my right of trial by jury. I'd been denied my right to plead guilty or not guilty. I'd been denied a trial even, for I couldn't consider that what I had received at Niagara Falls was a trial. I'd not been allowed to communicate with a lawyer nor anyone, and hence had been denied my right of suing for a writ of habeas corpus. My face had been shaved, my hair cropped close, convict stripes had been put on my body. I was forced to toil hard on a diet of bread and water and to march the shameful lockstep with armed guards over me. And all for what? What had I done? What crime had I committed against the good citizens of Niagara Falls, that all this vengeance should be wreaked upon me? I had not even violated their sleeping out ordinance. I'd slept outside their jurisdiction in the country that night. I'd not even begged for a meal or battered for a light peace on their streets. All that I'd done was to walk along their sidewalk and gaze at their Picayune waterfall. And what crime was there in that? So that's an outraged Jack London. I do think some of these stories are just great to read, to see the country, and in this case, America, in a different light to how we see it now. I was lucky enough to go to Niagara Falls this summer, and it's an incredibly built up place, the town around the falls. And I bet when Jack London went there, it was completely deserted, which must have been amazing. So it's great to read some of these older stories of tramping along and living in the wilderness, living on your wits, seeing how they were able to get away with things in those days because nobody was so much pinned down by technology as we are today. So, moving on to George Orwell, Down and Out in Paris and London. This is the first full-length work by author George Orwell, published in 1933. And it's a memoir in two parts on the theme of poverty in the two cities. So Orwell starts off working in London in various pubs and restaurants and being a cleaner-upper and a washer-upper. And then he in the second half of the book, he goes to live in Paris, and he lives on various sofas. He sofa surfs and becomes very ill while he's staying in a lodging house, and then he's robbed. And the thief was either somebody breaking in, or it might have actually been a young woman who came, who he picked up from the streets and brought back to his house. But he didn't write about that in his book because he didn't want to shame his parents. So nobody quite knows what happened. But the fact that he was robbed actually led to him living in a more hand-to-mouth way for a few weeks until he eventually went back to London and wrote home for money to get back on his feet. But because he was robbed and because he was made homeless, he then did write his first full-length work, and that's what set him on his path to becoming a writer. So they're also really interesting to read, all the chapters of Down and Out in Paris and London, because, like the Jack London book that we were talking about just now, it shows you a different stage of life, a different era when you could be someone that was down and out in a very different way to the way that you're homeless now. Also, of course, George Orwell did have the mind and soul of a poet, so was able to write about it in a very beautiful and well observed way. So they're really great stories as well. The Down and Out in Paris and London. Now moving on to Stuart, A Life Backwards by Alexander Masters, which we did mention earlier. This is in the Ben Myers essay, who was talking about homelessness, and Ben Myers was talking about the fact that Alexander Masters, who wrote the story about Stuart, who was the tramp, was in fact a Cambridge academic who'd been educated at Bedales, and he tells the story on behalf of Stuart, who he met one day in Cambridge, and Alexander Masters was amazed at how eloquent and how amazingly able to state his case Stuart was, and that's why Alexander Masters told his story. So Alexander Masters is a Cambridge dwelling academic man who first encounters Stuart Shorter, a beggar extraordinaire, in 1998 in a doorway near Sydney Sussex College in Cambridge. He had an oddly twisted way of sitting on his square of cardboard, as if his limbs were made half of rubber. His mouth was a sluice, says Masters. Then the next time they met, Masters had a part-time job as a fundraiser at Winter Comfort, which is a centre for rough sleepers. And there was a meeting where Masters got together with lots of homeless people because one of Masters' friends had been convicted of knowingly allowing the supply of heroin on the premises of Winter Comfort. And there was this kind of complex potential court case going on down. And while they were having that meeting, Stuart Shorter, who is a homeless man, also known as Psycho, also known as Knife Man Dan, because he's obsessed with knives, begins to speak in this very eloquent fashion, and Alexander Masters becomes entranced by him and by his story. And Masters and Stuart began campaigning together. They mounted a mass rough sleep out on a pavement beside the Home Office, and as they get to know each other more, Masters decides that he really wants to write a book about Stuart Shorter, one that will try to explain how he became one of the chaotic homeless, who are neither bankrupts nor runaways. They are people that have chosen to be homeless, if one can say that. I mean, nobody deliberately chooses to be homeless, but that is how Stuart described himself, that he had, in a sense, chosen his life. So Stuart is very excited by the fact that Alexander is about to write this book, and he says he wants it to be a bestseller, a page turner. And amazingly enough, Alexander Masters was able to turn it into a page turner because he brought the book to Stuart to show him what it was like having written the story of Stuart's life. I think when he wrote it, Stuart was in his late 30s, and he had once been a happy young boy of 12 with hopes and dreams. And he showed it to Stuart, and Stuart said it was incredibly boring, and he thought it was terrible, and he wanted him to rewrite it and make it much better. And that's the moment that Alexander decided to write Stuart's life backwards, starting from him being a homeless man living in the streets of Cambridge and going all the way back to the moment when he, in a way, turned a corner, age 12, to becoming ultimately the person living on the street. And the great thing about Stuart is that even though he is an alcoholic and he's taken quite a lot of quite a lot of drugs in his life, he still has enough undestroyed brain cells left to describe what his life is like, what his life has been like. And he can also pinpoint almost to the hour between 4 and 5 p.m. one weekday in early summer when he was 12, the symbolic moment when he made the change from, in his mother's words, a real happy-go-lucky little boy, always very considerate, into the nightmare clockwork orange figure of the last 2 decades. And that is what Alexander did to Stuart's story. He made it into an absolutely fascinating page-turning book, which I would very much recommend. It's non-fiction, it's a biography, but it's told in this very creative and interesting, eloquent fashion. So another one to definitely read if you haven't read it already. That's Stuart, A Life Backwards. And I think it also gives you a really good insight into what happened to Stuart and how he became what he was. He did have quite a lot of trauma as a child, as a teenager. He had muscular dystrophy, which obviously makes your life much harder. And he was abused in his teens. So there's a lot of awful things that have happened to him. And he is a really great spirit. But I won't tell you anymore because it's a really great story. So I just wanted to mention this again because I haven't really talked about it. So Mark Johnson wrote this great book called Wasted, which describes his youth and adulthood. He very early on got very much into drugs. He hated school. He played truant from school constantly. He became immersed in the drugs and music of the rave scene in the 1990s, emerging addicted to heroin and crack. He finally left crime, drink, and drugs behind him, though, in 2000. So he was born in the 1970s. So it was in his 30s that he finally was able to turn his back on drink and drugs. And for about 15 years, he lived on the streets of Soho. And this is a bulk of the description of the novel. We start off with his childhood, so we do realise where he came from, and talking about his early life. But then there's a very large section which is all about living on the streets of Soho and managing to make money by stealing CDs from HMV and then reselling them at an enormous profit, I have to say. But the wonderful thing about Mark Johnson that makes it so inspiring is that he eventually, after having turned his back on alcoholism and drug addiction, he started his own tree surgery company and employed only other homeless people to help them get off the streets. And he now is an advisor to the government on both the National Probation Service and the Prince's Trust. And he's been spearheading a number of projects aiming to bring young offenders and addicts back into society. So that's a very inspiring book. Now, realising time's going to run out, Nomadland by Jessica Bruder, Surviving America in the 21st Century. It's a 2017 non-fiction book by an American journalist, Jessica Bruder, about the phenomenon of older Americans who adopted transient lifestyles traveling around the United States in search of seasonal work, and they are van dwelling. Um, so it's a really compelling, interesting, brilliant read. Jessica Bruder writes brilliantly, and the story in the book is about Linda May. She's the main character, but there's lots of other characters who she meets on the way and who we get involved with, who is a really interesting woman in her. She's just turned 60, and she's living in a van, working for Amazon, and also working on various kind of campsites as an itinerant worker. And what's so fascinating about it is not just her, but all the other people in the same situation who have been forced for various reasons to give up their homes, and go and live a nomadic life on the road. And she's not sorry for herself. She's very practical. She very much gets on with life, and all the other people that she meets are the same. And they, in a way, have a kind of romance, a romantic ideal that they are nomads and that they're embracing a kind of life on the road, and they're being pioneers, they're being kind of cowboys, living a life of intrigue and excitement. But the reality of their lives is actually pretty grim. They're often having to do backbreaking work. They're giving themselves injuries. They're quite often having to have unpaid days because they've tripped over and they're not able to do the work for Amazon. And Amazon, I have to say, comes out of this horribly. It definitely puts you off that next Amazon purchase. And it's interesting because the book focuses mostly on Linda May, and we have a really positive relationship with her, partly because she is having this vision that she wants to build herself an earth ship, which would be a self-sufficient house. And that's what she wants to eventually do. And she has this goal that that's where she's going. In the film is about a woman called Fern, who's a fictionalized person based on many of the characters in the book. And she's played in the film by Frances McDormand, and she's an amazing actor, absolutely brilliant. Totally recommend that you watch the film, but also read the book. They're quite different to each other, both brilliant in their different ways. And the film doesn't focus so much on all the different evil capitalist regimes such as Amazon. It's more about the people, the nomadic people living in their RVs. And it talks about, both book and film talk about, in a way, the end of retirement and how retirement is quite a sort of modern social construct. In the olden days, people used to work until they dropped. And now these people in America are doing the same. They're having to work until they drop. There's people in their 70s who are working in Amazon or on campsites where they're having to clean out the loos and do the security and lug water around the campsite. And our heroine in both book and film, Linda May and Fern, both have to do all of these very physical jobs in their 70s and 80s, and they're seniors, as you say, in America. And it's highly depressing. And occasionally there are beautiful moments of joy and beauty, and quite often they're living in the desert under the stars. They often have dogs, and it is all beautiful, and there is a sense of camaraderie, but their daily life is brutal and grim and horribly underappreciated, and Amazon has a lot to answer for. But it's actually not just Amazon. There's a lot of other companies that are doing the same, like fish hatcheries, beet farms, and campgrounds, who are all doing a similar kind of thing, hiring itinerant older people who are willing to come and work there because they have no other choice. Because who is going to hire a 70-year-old, as they rightly say? Um, and the people in Nomadland have often become homeless or become in this state of nomadic life for many different reasons. One of them, in the book, Nomadland, was once a massively successful earner in the city, a banker in the US, and he was spending hundreds of thousands a year on fast cars and having a really luxurious lifestyle. And now he is living in an RV and working for Amazon, earning $12 or $14 an hour. So he's one of them. Other people, and that happened to him because he lost all his money in the financial crash of 2008. But other people have lost their money because they've divorced, or because they've lost someone, maybe lost a child on some occasions, and are so devastated that they can't cope with life, and so they've gone off to live a nomadic life, seeing no other point in what they're doing. Shane, lovely to see you joining us this evening from America. I wonder if you've met any of these itinerant older people in their 60s and 70s who've been forced to go and work for Amazon in these distant camps in the middle of nowhere. It is a fascinating topic, and I wonder if the same kind of behaviour is going to spread to the UK. It seems quite likely, with the enormous Amazon warehouses spreading out around us. Um, Anyway, so that's Nomadland, absolutely brilliant non-fiction book, which I completely recommend. Really good read, great as an audiobook as well, and fantastic as a film. Quite a different story, guaranteed to make you cry and be quite depressing. So, having read that, a more upbeat book on the same topic is Paper Cup by Karen Campbell. And this is a really fantastic novel, only just out. Karen Campbell is a Scottish author who was a policewoman turned author. And this is her eighth novel. And it tells a really interesting tale of a woman who goes on a journey. It's a kind of odyssey, and she is a homeless woman. So she's in that same vein of books such as Rachel Joyce's Unlikely Pilgrimage of Harold Fry, Jonas Jonason's The Man Who Stepped Out of the Window and Disappeared, and Emma Hooper's Etta, Otto and Russell and James, which is another great favourite book of mine, which is set in Saskatchewan when an old lady decides to go on a journey across the entire country, and she's 84, and there's a coyote involved as well. Anyway, this is in the same kind of literary genre as those books about someone deciding to go off on a journey for a particular reason, and her reason is a great one, if slightly fairy tale like, which is that our heroine is a homeless woman, and she happens to be sitting in Glasgow on a bench when a very drunken bride who's on her hen night sits down next to her, absolutely pissed. They have a bit of a conversation. There's lots of sort of madness going on, and the next thing we know is that our heroine Kelly has found this bride's diamond ring, which she accidentally left behind in her drunkenness. And Kelly puts it on her finger, and decides, as the bride has disappeared, that she's got to get the ring back to the bride before the wedding day. So then ensues this rather fantastically mad journey as Kelly, homeless woman with almost no money, she does have a little bit of cash on her, and we see moments when she manages to get a bit more cash for various reasons. She has to go on this odyssey to take the ring back to the bride who's getting married, and Kelly has picked up when she was getting married and where she lives, or roughly where she lives, the right village. So off she goes on her journey, and she has lots of really fantastic adventures as she goes. We hear her story as to how she became homeless, and that's what makes it such a great novel, that we utterly empathise with her. She started off as a successful university student. She was very clever, she was very popular, and then she discovered drink and started getting incredibly drunk and being the life and soul of the party, and it all spirals downhill. She goes and lives in this flat and she can't pay the rent, and it's all horribly depressing, and you are feeling horribly like, oh my god, this could happen so easily. It's so depressing, and so normal life seems so fragile when you see it through her eyes. It seems all so horribly something that could happen to any of us. And poor Kelly tells us her story in snippets. We get to hear what happened to her and how she did have a boyfriend and how she nearly got pregnant and so on, and how things led to her being on her own and having nowhere to live. We hear about her father and her best friend. She acquires a dog called Cauliflower or Choufleur. And I won't give you everything away, but that's a really lovely thing. So the dog comes with her. She at one point pretends to be a French actress, which is absolutely hilarious. And she gets a lift with some people in a van, and she's impersonating a French actress very badly, and they completely see through everything that she's saying. But it's a really great moment, and it's very much a fantastic odyssey. And I really enjoyed the book Paper Cup. I would thoroughly recommend it, and I think you would definitely enjoy it, and it's a great one on audio as well. I'm just going to read you a little bit about that book from Claire Fuller, who we all know, fantastic author of Unsettled Ground, which is another amazing book that actually talks about the fragility of normal, ordinary existence. And actually, she has two characters who are homeless in Unsettled Ground because they're twins who whose mother dies unexpectedly. They're 52. They've always lived with their mother. They don't know anything about the world. They don't have bank accounts. And when their mother dies, they're left high and dry, and they discover that the house they live in is actually not their house. And suddenly they have nowhere to go. So that's obviously why Claire Fuller wrote about this book, Paper Cup. Just put that connection together. Claire Fuller, we love her. We love her books. And she's got a new one coming out, which I'm just reaching for so that I can show it off to you. But I don't know how I'm going to find it quickly. Which stars an octopus. Very exciting. Anyway, here's a bit by Claire Fuller about Paper Cup by Karen Campbell. It's Kelly's interior voice and her notes to self that lift this book, creating a character who is both vulnerable and striving to do better, so that even when she gets drunk enough to behave abominably, her actions are ultimately forgivable. Kelly uses the voice in her head to urge herself on, to shut down painful memories and to berate herself. Kelly, Kelly, when did your life conspire against you? When did you start to pretend that drinking hair lacquer mixed with milk was fine? But amid the vomit and the piss, her moments of pleasure are vivid and visceral, and the reader feels them even more for everything else that is denied her. The narrative focuses on the citrus creaminess of a plate of bread and butter pudding with marmalade, the architecture she notices as she passes through towns and villages, and so on. And that's what makes the book so enjoyable, that Kelly actually has this amazing ability to appreciate the world around her, even though she absolutely stinks. She's got this awful coat that smells of pee. Everyone she meets recoils in horror when they smell her. And she has to resort to doing quite dastardly things, like breaking into someone's hotel room in order to have a bath, which is awful but also hilarious, and also stealing a tip, um, or stealing the money that was left on somebody's cafe table in order to then go and buy a toothbrush and all those things. And Karen Campbell really brilliantly captures those awful decisions that you have to make when you're homeless, as to whether to spend that tiny bit of money that you've got on food or on making yourself clean, so that people are going to like you and maybe give you a lift in their van, which is better. You've got to feed your dog as well. How do you feed the dog? All these terrible decisions. So it's a really excellent novel about being homeless that really brings the plight of being homeless to life. I'm still just trying to look for this book that I want to show off to you, but I don't know if I'm going to find it this evening. I don't think I am. I'm going to have to show it to you next time. So do consider, when you're next going past a homeless person in the street, the words of Mark Johnson, who was homeless himself for at least 12 years. When they're asking for money, do give them money. He said, just don't even think about it. If you've got some money, don't be thinking, oh, they're only going to go and spend it on booze or drugs. Even if that's true, it's still better to give them some money, because any help is going to be appreciated, and they might just go and be able to go and stay the night in a hostel. And the other thing is, do try and talk to the homeless person. Don't ignore them, because one of the most terrible things about being homeless that comes out in all of these fiction and non-fiction books is that people don't talk to you, people ignore you, people try and pretend that you're not there, and you're gradually going to become more and more lacking in self-esteem, to the point where many homeless people end up committing suicide. And homeless people have really, of course, terrible mental health. So do talk to people, do give homeless people money, and do also get in touch with local charities that can help. In the UK here, we have StreetLink, which is a really cool charity that you can look up, which you can alert StreetLink to homeless people if you're worried about someone over 18 who you think might be living outside and might be living in a dangerous situation. You can tell StreetLink that you're concerned about them and that they need help. So that's one thing you can do. You can also support The Big Issue, which is an amazing magazine, which I'm sure all the English people know about. And they do amazing things to help the homeless. And you can also support the House St Barnabas in London, who are a really fantastic charity who help homeless people get off the streets and go back into work, which is fantastic. They have something called the Academy, and they have lots of people who have been homeless and who they've helped to get back into the world of work, into catering, and many other kinds of jobs. So do think about all those charities, particularly at this time of year when things are getting colder. And thank you so much for joining me tonight. I'm going to end it on that note. And also do send in me any suggestions that you want about different topics that we might cover over the next few weeks. I'm going to be looking quite soon at my books of the year in December on my next Damien Bar Literary Salon session, which is mid-December. Um, and I've been asked to do a session on screwed up parents, maybe parents that screw you up, which will be really interesting. And I've got quite a lot of other ones up my sleeve, but it's always great to hear your thoughts if you've got pet topics. Um, Shane, maybe I should do one about moving to another continent. That would be interesting. Anyway, lovely to see you all. Thanks for coming. And I'll see you next week. Good night.